You've got a fancy new camera and you really don't know what you can do with it and the sort of settings that you can play with. In today's video, I'm going to explain the exposure triangle and something that I tend to call the exposure square, which will make a little bit more sense as we get into this. But let's just roll that intro first. Hit it. When switching from automatic mode to manual mode on your camera, there are a few different things that you need to take into regard when taking a photo. You don't want to overexpose a photo, underexpose a photo, or make too many things in the frame seem in focus or out of focus. So we need to focus on the exposure triangle. So this is a 3-point triangle like this, and we have different values for each area. So you have ISO, which is your basically your level of integration within the camera in terms of light sensitivity. You have your aperture, which is the amount of stuff that is in focus. So with a low aperture, so f1.8, it's going to be a very shallow depth of field with the background blur. And then I'll give a few example images in a brief second. And then as your final thing that you need to take into account when sort of putting this together is your shutter speed. So your shutter speed is how quickly the sort of sensor takes the photo. So in an old DSLR camera, it would be the amount of time it takes for the mirror to flip up and shut down. But then with a more electronic camera like the one I've got here, it's the amount of time before the shutter window closes. So with that, with the shutter speed, if you have a faster shutter speed, you're going to let less light into the camera, but it will freeze the subjects in frame. Whereas when you have a higher shutter speed, more stuff is moving in the frame and it can create more blur, but at the same time, more light is being let into the frame. So when you justify and create the perfect image, you need to make sure all of these values are equal to each other. So if my ISO is really, really high, I'm going to experience noise in my image. But if I can drop my ISO and then open my aperture to a lower stop, then I'll be able to let more light into the lens. So that's the general sort of gist of it. These obviously also level out in sort of exposure. So as you look down your camera's viewfinder, you will see a viewfinder bar in the center, and that shows your level of exposure. So what you tend to want to do, unless you're trying to underexpose or overexpose for certain sort of artistic reasons, you want that bar to be directly in the center. And that means that that image is perfectly exposed and means that you basically have the image that you would be wanting. When you look at more artistic sort of viewpoints and taking photos for certain reasons, so say I'm taking a portrait, my aperture wants to be lower than everything else. So then I obviously need to take into account a higher ISO or a lower ISO and a lower or faster shutter speed. So you obviously do need to vary these things. So say I'm taking sporting events, so a car, I would want a more justified aperture, so I need a wider aperture. So I'm going to open that up to about f10. Then my ISO is probably going to stick in the neighborhood of about 500 to 600, and my shutter speed is going to be about 1/4000. So that's 1/4000th of a second in order for it to work. Obviously depends on the light you're having on the day, all this sort of stuff, but you do really need to play with those in order to experience and understand the breadths and depths of the exposure triangle. To confuse you a little bit more and change things up a little bit more, I tend to don't look at it as an exposure triangle. I mean, this is basically the everything people refer to, but I refer to it as an exposure square because there are actually 4 points that you need to take into account when setting up your camera. You have your ISO, you have your aperture, and you have your shutter speed, but this fourth little one over here is actually neutral density filters. So you could just class it as any filters, but I like classing it as NDs, mainly because they affect the sort of light that you can let into your lens. Say you want to use a really low aperture and a really shallow depth of field, you want to drop your ISO to reduce the amount of noise that you've got in an image, and you also want to keep your shutter speed pretty fair and not have any motion blur, you need to use a neutral density filter. And they're basically like sunglasses in front of a lens. They reduce the amount of light, and you can have different stops of neutral density, and that basically enables you to control the amount of light coming into your camera, thus being able to toggle the settings to a more justified, a more specified degree. So just take those into account. They are very, very widely used in filming because they allow you to manipulate light, especially when you're shooting outdoors as well. They are more fantastic than anything else and really helps you control more settings in your camera. That has been it for today's explanation sort of guide video. If you have any questions about the exposure triangle or furthermore the exposure square, drop a message down in the comments and I will get back to you trying explaining some more sort of camera settings. I've got more of these sort of camera basics videos and video basic videos coming up very soon, so stay tuned for that. But if you like these videos, please hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Thank you very, very much for watching. See ya.